Nigel Bankes, a retired law professor from the University of Calgary, and I are connected on Twitter, and he had a couple of interesting tweets today about Alberta climate policy, or lack thereof. I'm going to read them to you, and then we'll be talking to him about it. So here we go. Alberta needs climate change accountability legislation that, at a minimum, sets targets consistent with Canada's nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, requires a strategy to meet those targets, and requires annual reporting. Second tweet. Alberta's current Emissions Management and Climate Resilience Act does none of these things. And until we have a real carbon accountability legislation, and here's the kicker, nobody will take us seriously. Welcome to the interview, Nigel.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, you made that point fairly bluntly. What were you getting at?
I'm getting really at two things. One thing that you've talked about a lot, with the lack of a coherent climate policy. But then I'm taking it one step beyond that and saying, once we've got a policy, we also need to make sure that we've got some accountability through legislation.
I agree, and we have a federal model to follow, as you pointed out in subsequent tweets. That legislation has been passed at the federal level recently. Well, what are the? If you could maybe describe that briefly.
So sure, what the federal legislation does is to establish a net zero target for 2050. And then it walks back from that and says we have to establish targets for critical 5-year periods between now and 2050. And that those targets have got to be based on the best science, and they've got to be ratcheting up. In other words, they've got to become more ambitious over time. And then it requires, in addition to those targets, a plan for achieving those targets and reporting on the plan. I believe it's on achievements on the plan. I believe it's on an annual basis.
Well, let's go back and talk about Alberta climate policy. Now, of course, under the NDP, Rachel Notley was the premier. They had the Climate Leadership Plan introduced in November of 2015. When Jason Kenney and the UCP formed government in 2019, they immediately disassembled much of it. And since then, what climate policy there is has been very piecemeal and mostly put in place to avoid the federal government's backstop legislation on things like industrial emitters tax. So I think it's fair to say that Alberta has no coherent climate plan or climate policy. Would you agree? Absolutely.
And even though I think the Notley government climate leadership plan had elements of a plan, large elements of a plan, it wasn't a comprehensive plan. It had the coal phase out, it had the renewable electricity target of 30% by 2030, but it didn't set, and it had the 100 megaton cap on oil sands, but it didn't set an overall set of targets. So I agree that the climate leadership plan is probably the best climate policy and therefore energy policy that Alberta's ever had, but it wasn't comprehensive.
Yes, fair enough. And so there will be many Albertans maybe who are watching this and say, well, why do we care? I mean, aside from the fact, not everybody is all that keen about meeting climate targets. We know that there's some debate in Alberta, especially on the conservative camp. But I want to get back to the letter that the Teck Resources CEO wrote, and I think it was 2019, when they withdrew their application for the Frontier mine, oil sands mine. And that letter, it was 2 pages, it had 10 paragraphs in it, and 7 of them dealt with climate policy. And the CEO said very clearly, every jurisdiction has to have coherent climate policy, because if you don't have it, then big companies operating within that jurisdiction are not going to get financed. We can't access capital unless we are managing climate risk, and the jurisdiction is seen by the financial community to be managing climate risk. So even just take the climate targets out of it, to operate in today's environment, you have to have climate policy. That's just like, it's like the ante in a poker game. It's got to be there. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And industry will always say they want certainty. We can live with aggressive targets. We see the need for ambition, but we want to know what the rules of the game are, and we want some certainty going forward. And if we go back to Alberta's earliest climate legislation, the specified gas emitter regulations, you'll recall it wasn't until the ND government was elected that we saw any schedule for changing the level of ambition of those ESCA regulations. It didn't happen under Stelmach. It didn't happen under Prentice. And industry was saying, well, tell us what's going to happen. And so I think that's one of the excellent things about the federal policy, which will see a scheduled increase in the price of carbon, and people can plan with that and work with that.
And my observation, Nigel, is that one of the things that's come out of the COP26 is the ratcheting up of ambition, the further commitment of the financial community under the leadership of Mark Carney to put more money, more capital into the energy transition. And I can't remember if it was actually in the statement, but I think it's implied that fossil fuel projects will have more trouble getting capital. And so if there was, as much as we may have needed a climate plan in the past, going forward post COP26, it seems that is now imperative. And it seems that the Kenney government has absolutely no interest in going down that road.
That looks like an accurate assessment to me. I mean, of course, we know that the Premier decided not to attend COP26. I gather we have a very small number of officials there. And we seem to be content with making announcements about the hydrogen economy, making announcements about technical developments and innovations, and almost just hoping that the rest of the world won't notice.
Yes, I think that's a pretty accurate assessment. Now, in your estimation as a legal expert, how difficult would it be? I mean, especially given that other provinces have got legislation and climate plans. BC comes to mind. The federal government has it. I mean, there are lots of models out there for Alberta to copy. How hard would it be to cobble together a credible climate plan and put in place the necessary legislation and regulations?
Well, I'll give you two responses. One on the legislation side, so sort of the accountability legislation that I was talking about in those tweets. That would be very, very easy to do. As you say, we've got lots of examples from the UK, New Zealand, British Columbia to work with, as well as the federal legislation. Getting it through the legislature, of course, would be exceptionally challenging. On the policy side of things, I mean, I think that would be more challenging for us, and I would defer to folks like Andrew Leach, who was very heavily involved in assisting the Notley government in developing a climate leadership plan. I mean, I think there would be a number of elements to it. I'd say that takes me beyond my expertise.
Well, a final question, Nigel, and it's more of an observation, I guess, but you talked about how even if a Kenney government brought this forward, they might have trouble getting it through the legislature. And really what you're talking about is the divisions within the UCP caucus. I mean, we've seen the caucus split over the COVID-19 regulations, public health measures. And surely, I think it would be a fair guess to say that there would be similar splits along, if the government tried to bring in, more comprehensive climate policy and legislation. And that means that it's almost like we're at a stalemate, where it's stasis. There would no movement on this because the government can't get its own act together.
Yes, I think realistically we're probably waiting until 2023 and the next election. I guess one of the things that I would sort of add to what we've been talking about is that even on those issues where it should be easy to get good policy leadership from the government, we're not getting it. And the best example for this to me is of carbon capture and storage, where the province, when we have a carbon capture and storage policy, we have carbon capture and storage legislation, but the province is talking about changing it. And it did that by issuing an information letter in the early part of the spring, and then kind of walking back from that, and then asking for calls for proposals. It's even the things we can do and should be able to do, we're not doing a good job of in moving towards a low carbon future.
This reminds me of a conversation I had, an interview I had with Professor Dwayne Brott, political scientist at the Mount Royal University. And we were talking about the COVID situation in Alberta. And he said the Kenney government is so incompetent that it couldn't manage a lemonade stand. It is the worst government in the history of Alberta, for sure, he said. And it can't do these simple things. It can't even bring in legislation and shepherd it through the legislature and do that and manage that process correctly. It just, everything always seems to be a crisis. It sounds like you would agree with that.
Yes, I think we saw another example of that the other day when the resolution that was first introduced to amend the Constitution Act pursuant to the referendum, they forgot to add the schedule. But so even something that was near and dear to their heart, they messed up on. So yes, a level of incompetence.
Well, on that note, Nigel, thank you very much for your insights. Always appreciate them.
Thank you. Thanks for the chance to rant.